Hi, welcome to Nonverbal Communication. This tends to be a chapter favorite, which is another reason why I saved it for near the end of the course. So it's interesting, in different textbooks, they typically have different percentages of what amount of communication is verbal and then what amount of communication is nonverbal. I've seen it range for the nonverbal part between the low 60s and the high 70s. So the takeaway that I want you to have from this is that we definitely express more through nonverbal communication than verbal. So the other takeaway for life, when those two don't match, always believe the nonverbal communication. I'm not a huge fan of cliches, but that's why the adage that actions sometimes speak louder than words helps display that pie chart. So this chapter is divided into four main contexts, all focusing on nonverbal. We're going to be talking about relational, professional, cultural, and gender. When it talks about the relational, the social, the interpersonal part of relationships, they give a lot of key findings from studies. So for instance, the establishment and maintenance of relationships. Those kinds of things might be turn taking. Those kinds of things might be in terms of hugs or touch. And the more we are skilled at being able to encode, to give a message, and decode, receive it the way that people want it to be received, we tend to be more competent communicators. And that's why the textbook goes on to say that when we're skilled at it, we typically have interpersonal advantages. So those kinds of things can absolutely happen with friends in terms of turn taking and cues. What it means by increases our expressivity, that might be in our face, it might be in our gestures. Think about people you know who are really good storytellers. Those nonverbals probably complement it, with an E, in a lot of great ways. In terms of conveying emotional meaning, think about when you're on the phone with somebody. I know a lot of people text these days, but if you pick up and you could just hear in someone's voice what they're feeling, whether they are talking really fast so they're enthusiastic, or maybe it is much lower and slower and you could sense some sadness there. In terms of studies on loneliness and anxiety, typically what happened were the people who were less skilled tended to be more lonely. And sometimes the reason for that, the textbook goes in to say, is because if they don't have that social network, they might put all their burdens on one or two people and not recognize those cues when people are falling back. So this is all about the relational context. Next, we're going to move into the professional one. So this is pretty interesting. One of the studies that the textbook found was that this is so important on the job in terms of nonverbal, but there's hardly any training for it. This is why I think COM 101 is one of the most important courses that you'll take in your college career, much more so than just the public speaking part, but for the interpersonal part that you get in this, which I've been saying from the beginning. Some of the things that employees reported is that a lot of times that they get mixed signals from managers. So maybe their body language tells them something different than what a manager is saying to them. And because of that, people were very unhappy on the job because they didn't know what to trust. The truth is that gut instinct was probably telling them more about the nonverbal, but maybe the verbal was telling them positive things. So again, always remember to believe the nonverbal versus the verbal when the two don't match. In terms of context, power, and status considerations, one of the things that the textbook mentioned is that people with lower status will often pay attention to the nonverbals of the higher status. Now, the best kinds of communicators are always the one who pay attention to these things regardless of status. So for instance, you might go into work and your manager might notice your slumped shoulders, they might notice that you're not talking as much, and they might pull you aside and ask if everything's going okay. Sure, in terms of the professional part, they might be more okay with putting a hand on, reaching on your shoulder than you might do it back to them. But that's what we mean in terms of status considerations. Usually, the more competent communicators are the ones who are paying attention regardless of hierarchy. In terms of creating supportive climates, the idea of mirroring. So you might notice if you are flirting with someone that a lot of your body language might tend to take on the same mannerisms, whether it's crossing your leg, whether it's putting an arm out. That's what we mean by mirroring. And a lot of times you'll see this in job interviews too. The way that we convey professionalism and enthusiasm definitely has an effect in terms of perception. So you might go into a job interview and you're feeling very, very nervous, so you tend to look away. Well, think about what that might convey in terms of nonverbals and perception. So when you think about it, it might be that you're really, really nervous, but you're still tending to make that eye contact because you want to show enthusiasm. So a lot of times those nonverbal cues matter, especially in terms of turn taking with conversation. The next one that we're going to move into is cultural. Now, there are a lot of vocab words up here, these jargon terms. Jargon means the technical term, so anything that's in bold. So it's a good idea to make a list of these kinds of words just so you don't mix them up. So when we're talking about kinesics, we're talking about body language. When we're talking about oculesics, that is in terms of eye movement. So what's interesting about the cultural context are there are a lot of differences. So the textbook gives the example that in Greece, if you might give a finger to someone, in terms of thumbs up, that might be saying, like the textbook uses up yours or F you, where we used to use it for hitchhiking. I know a lot of people don't do that today, but back in the day, the signal was for that. Or okay might be fantastic here in the States, but again, it's an offensive term elsewhere. When it moves into the next one on bowing, they talk a lot in the textbook about contact versus non-contact cultures. So this is something that was in the news many years ago in terms of how low, at the time, President Obama was bowing with the person in leadership from Japan. So in Japan, when people bow, it's a form of respect. And the person who goes lower means that they're subordinate to the higher person in the bow. So this generated a lot of news where Obama, in his mind, was simply just being respectful. It goes on to talk about, in terms of Native American culture, that eye contact, looking someone in the eye, is deemed disrespectful. Other cultures that see it very often as disrespectful, if you grew up in a military family, lots of Asian families, African American, it's actually more respectful to look away than look at someone in the eye. Where lots of times the notion is we must look at people in the eye in order to convey respect. So a lot of times these differences absolutely could be misconstrued. The next one is on haptics, and that's the study of touch. So again, when the textbook goes into contact versus non-contact cultures, sometimes when people are holding hands, there's absolutely no romantic connotation. They give the example of two men in Saudi Arabia who might be walking hand in hand. Here in the States, if people do it, people might think that there's a romantic part to it. So again, all of this depends and varies by culture. Vocalics, another word for that is paralanguage we see in some textbooks. That's the way that we use our voice. So the volume, the pitch, the rate, the speed. And the authors give examples of when they were traveling around the world of when people were very loud in restaurants, that sometimes people were asked to leave just based on where they were, because the volume made a difference. In terms of proxemics, get it? This is the study of space. To use that past example that they were talking about with vocalics, When we're talking about space, which is very interesting in a corona world that we're in, the idea of having more space, so we're always talking about this 6 feet distance versus less space. So they were giving the example in restaurants where the tables were almost on top of each other. And this was all obviously before Corona. Now, when we have all these settings in terms of space, we might be more comfortable or less comfortable. And a lot of this has to do with culture. So, for instance, in lots of South American places, people are much more comfortable with closer distance, as opposed to in South Asian countries, people want much further apart. And then chronemics is the study of time. So for instance, if you're in New York and if you have ever missed that last train right out of Penn Station, you know that we are a culture here in the States very, very focused on time. You miss it by a minute and it's gone. However, you probably know that in a lot of European countries, the focus on time is very, very different. So for instance, everything might close down for siesta time, because that culture, anywhere you're going in a lot of places in Europe, is much more focused on a different way of life, and time just isn't quite as important. The last part of the chapter that it goes into is the gender context. And Catherine Dindia is one of the most famous gender scholars, and she has built off John Gray's earlier work. You might have heard of the psychologist John Gray. He wrote back in the 80s or 90s, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And that's what you see up here. Well, building off his work, she decided to phrase it a little bit differently. That maybe it's more that men are from North Dakota and women are from South Dakota. And what she means by that is we have a lot more in common than all the differences. Just like you were reading about a few chapters ago in terms of culture and race, that 99% of DNA is the same, she uses that same kind of percentage, that men and women, we are 99% alike. However, in terms of communication, there's a huge area of study of this. And I suppose I would say it focuses on that 1% difference. So in terms of this last part of the chapter, they break it down very clearly and pretty easily and very interestingly in major differences between men and women in terms of body language and eye contact and facial expressions. Again, haptics in the study of touch, vocalics, the way that we use our voice, proxemics, the way men and women use our space, and also self-presentation. So I'm going to leave the very last part of the chapter up to you to check out those really interesting differences. Have a great day.